Is still very much in its infancy. I'm so excited to be on this panel with these wonderful scholars. We've seen some excellent work in the past decades, some of it by people in this room this morning, but this is a field where there is so much left to do. So I want to spend a few minutes highlighting some of this recent scholarship before laying out where I think the field is headed, and giving a few of my own thoughts on some potentially fruitful avenues for research. So in many ways, the field of Texas queer history has mirrored the development of U.S. queer history and other state-level histories, but with some exciting innovations. Following pioneers like John D'Amelio, George Chauncey, Elizabeth Kennedy, Madeline Davis, several scholars have documented the emergence of queer identities and the formation of queer communities in Texas. Karen Wesley, a professor at Tarrant County College, has given us groundbreaking insights into gay and lesbian communities in Dallas. Relying on archival materials and a wealth of oral history interviews, Wesley reveals how queer people began to build a sense of community in Dallas in the mid-1960s, but were divided by race, class, and gender. It was the community's response to the AIDS crisis of the 1980s that began to bridge some of those divisions. Amy Stone, a sociologist at Trinity University, published a book in 2017 on the annual San Antonio festival known as Corneation that began in 1951 and is now the longest running LGBTQ celebration in Texas. Like George Chauncey's discovery of a vibrant and visible queer culture in New York during the 1920s, Stone reveals that queer visibility has deep historical roots in this state. Community history initiatives have also been instrumental in preserving queer history in Texas. Yesterqueer, founded by Todd Camp, who's here with us today, is dedicated to uncovering the queer history of Fort Worth and Tarrant County. The Dallas Way, co-founded by its current president, Robert Emery, is doing the same in Dallas. And their organization has been helpful in building the largest LGBTQ archive in the state, now housed at my institution, the University of North Texas. J.D. Doyle, a community historian in Houston, has digitized thousands upon thousands of Texas queer publications and other documents in the online J.D. Doyle archives. Before he died a few years ago, Gene Elder amassed an impressive collection of materials related to San Antonio's queer history, and most of his collection is now at the University of Texas at San Antonio. All of this work has helped build a quite robust collection of work on queer identity formation and community building in Texas. Historians of queer Texas have also produced quite a bit of scholarship on social, political, and legal activism along the lines of national histories by John D'Amelio, Marcia Gallo, Lillian Faderman, William Eskridge, and others. Again, Karen Wesley, but also UT Tyler historian Reese Dotson have written about the gay and lesbian civil rights movement in Dallas, where the dominant strategy relied on respectability politics to work within the system to bring about change. Both Wesley and Dotson agree that this strategy produced victories, but often these achievements came at the cost of excluding trans people and queer people of color. John Goins, a historian at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, published an article a few years ago on queer political activism in Houston during the 1970s and 80s that documents the creation of the Houston Gay Political Caucus and the emergence of a formidable queer political bloc in the city. I would include my own work here as well. I published an article in 2018 in the Journal of Southern History on the battle for a non-discrimination ordinance in Houston in the mid-1980s that, if it had passed, would have protected gay and lesbian municipal employees. My recent book, Before Lawrence v. Texas, and my podcast, Queering the Lone Star State, both center legal activism in the movement for queer equality in Texas and build upon the foundation laid by SMU law professor Dale Carpenter in his book on the Lawrence v. Texas Supreme Court case. This work has shown that the struggle for queer equality has a long history and has included a diverse set of strategies and tactics and a wide range of successes and failures. There's also some recent work on queer Texas history that I think points in new and exciting directions for the field. Jean Alvear, a graduate student at SMU, is working on a much anticipated project on the development of a Latinx queer identity along the Texas-Mexico border dating back to the early 20th century. Similar to Amy Stone's work on queer visibility in San Antonio, Alvear has uncovered a surprising tolerance for female impersonators in Texas in the early 20th century, highlighting the need to study queer Texas history in periods where we might be surprised to find it. In a similar way, Josh Lopez at the University of North Texas has written about queer food history in Texas, specifically among queer Chicanx activists in El Paso. His dissertation asks how queer El Pasoans thought about food, how they built community through food, and how they enacted politics through food, also how they thought about their relationships with their own bodies. Lopez shows us that food narratives offer an intimate view into the material conditions and everyday lives of queer people. Much of the work on Texas queer history, like U.S. queer history, focuses on urban areas, but this is beginning to change as more historians answer the call from John Howard in his 1999 book, Men Like That we should pay more attention to the lives and experiences of rural queer people. University of Oklahoma historian Jennifer Holland is doing just that. She is currently writing a book manuscript, which I've had the great fortune to read, that focuses on anti-queer politics in the rural West, which includes a chapter on Texas during the AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s. Holland's work also demonstrates another recent development in the field, and that is that many historians are paying an increasing amount of attention to anti-queer activism and hate crimes against queer Texans. Chris Haight at Houston Community College published an article in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly a few years ago on how violent crimes against queer Texans provoked a powerful moment of coalition building in support of state and federal hate crimes legislation that would protect Black, Latinx, and queer Texans. Chris is currently polishing his manuscript, which again I've had the great fortune to read, expanding on this argument. Reese Dotson at UT Tyler is currently writing an article on the murder of Nicholas West in Tyler in 1993, paying particular attention to how anti-queer rhetoric in the region affected the sentencing of 3 men convicted of the crime. Edward Sebesta is here with us today, writing about anti-queer activities in Dallas, particularly bar and bathhouse raids by the police. These works show that scholars working on Texas queer history are leading the charge that is reshaping the way we understand LGBTQ history more broadly. One final recent development in the field that I want to mention is being spearheaded by Rice University anthropologist Brian Riedel, who published some of his research in a recent edition of Southern Spaces. Brian is using GIS technology in innovative ways to explore the role of cruising in queer territorialization and place claiming. He juxtaposes digital maps of queer businesses with an archive he built based on cruising narratives, discovering that what we normally think of as gayborhoods might not fully capture the vastness or complexity of queer urban spaces. Brian argues that in Houston, queer people claimed much more of the city than the neighborhood of Montrose, traditionally understood as Houston's main gayborhood. In fact, as Brian argues, there have been many contested queer territories that have spread across the city of Houston during the 20th century. I think Brian has given us historians much to think about when it comes to using digital tools like GIS to conceptualize the queer use of space in Texas. So when I survey the field of queer Texas history, I'm excited and energized by all of the excellent work that scholars have produced over the last decade or so, and the projects soon to be published. However, as I said, there's still much work to be done, which is also exciting, and that it presents so many opportunities for those of us doing this work, and also those of us considering doing this work. We welcome converts. The political activist Harvey Milk would often begin his political rallies by saying, "My name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you," right? Which operated on 2 levels. He did want to recruit more gay and lesbian political activists, but this is also to sort of rib the homophobes who thought that all gay people do is recruit other gay people. So, I am here to recruit you. In preparing for this part of my talk, I contacted active scholars in queer Texas history to get their insights into where the field should go from here. From those conversations, several themes emerge, and I'll just identify 5 of those briefly here. This, of course, is not an exhaustive list, but it does reflect what I think are suggested directions for the field of queer Texas history that we should take seriously. Several people told me, and I agree, that we need more trans histories of Texas. Chris Klein, Hernandez, Jen Holland, Todd Camp, Reese Dodson all mentioned this. Chris let me know that Victor Macias Gonzalez at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse is currently writing a book on trans Mexican women on the Texas-Mexico border, which will be a welcome addition. A few historians have mentioned in their work that the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston was an early pioneer of sexual confirmation surgeries during the 1960s. Funded by trans activist Reed Erickson, UTMB established a gender clinic in 1965, and the first transgender woman received surgery the following year. This topic deserves much more attention, and is just one example of a potential avenue for research. We need to know more about the experiences of trans and gender nonconforming individuals in Texas in all time periods, from indigenous cultures to the present. We also need to know more about queer people of color in Texas, as Todd Camp, Chris Haight, Reese Dodson all mentioned to me. These histories are often difficult to document, which is partly the result of the fact that queer communities in Texas have reflected some of the racism of the larger society. For example, many bars and nightclubs in Texas had multiple identification policies that were designed to prevent people of color from entering the doors. Because of discrimination like this, many queer people of color did not identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans or queer because they were made to feel like outsiders in the community. This has produced a real difficulty in locating sources documenting their lives. But of course, we have a responsibility and an obligation to include their voices in our histories despite the difficulties. Oral history can be one way to surmount those obstacles, as Patrick Johnson has shown in his study of black gay men in the South. In a related way, queering the borderlands is another theme I heard from those I spoke with. Josh Lopez thinks that a queer lens will continue to remind us that the Texas-Mexico border is not only a place of trans-border violence, but also a region with a history of queer community building and a celebration of hybrid life. Also related, Hillary Anderson at the University of Central Arkansas, who writes about lesbian feminist activism in the U.S. South during the 1970s, told me that she would like to see historians pay more attention to working-class queer Texans, along the lines of what Margot Canaday has begun to do in her recent book, Queer Career. SMU grad student Gene Alvear told me it was one of his priorities to extend the chronology of Texas queer history to periods before the 1960s. And of course, his work on female impersonation during the early 20th century is doing just that. I've long thought that we need a George Chauncey-style study of queer visibility and community building in Texas during the first half of the 20th century, akin to Gay New York. Was there a toleration and, dare we say, even an acceptance of gender nonconformity in Texas during the 1920s that disappeared later? Was there a pansy craze in Texas? Was there an acknowledgement of same-sex sexuality in Texas cowboy culture, as there was in much of the American West? And what about the 19th century? Was same-sex romantic and sexual behavior acceptable in Texas, as long as individuals eventually went on to marry opposite-sex partners and produce children? Were romantic friendships common in Texas? What about Boston marriages? I also heard from scholars working in this field that we should pay more attention to the emergence of a distinctive Texas queer identity and how it has shaped queer history in the state. This seems to me to present an especially fruitful yet frustrating set of questions. In my podcast series, for example, titled Queering the Lone Star State, I struggled to pinpoint what was distinctly Texan about the legal cases I chronicled in the movement for queer equality. And I think this is still an unresolved question even in the finished product. As Jen Holland phrased it, what makes Texas queer history different from other regions? And how specifically does region shape queerness? Finally, Todd Camp and Robert Emery reminded me that documenting the queer history of Texas would be damn near impossible without the continued preservation of queer archival materials. Their organizations, as I mentioned, Todd's Yesterqueer here in Fort Worth and Robert's The Dallas Way in Dallas, are doing vitally important work on the ground to make sure that scholars have the materials they need to write about Texas queer history. Through Robert's leadership, the Dallas Way and the University of North Texas enjoy a productive working relationship that has resulted in the largest LGBTQ archival collection in the state, which is housed at UNT. Incidentally, this might already be in the works, but I think UNT would be a fantastic institutional partner for Yesterqueer. So if that is not happening, let's make that happen. Although so much incredible and groundbreaking work has been done, the field of queer history in Texas is still in its infancy. For me, that's what makes working in this field so exciting. We've come a long way, but there is still so much left to do. So if you are queer history curious, if you're a scholar thinking about dipping your toe into the water of queer Texas history, if you're a graduate student thinking about this field, if you're a community historian wondering how you can help out, we have a place for you. And thankfully, this new Alliance for Texas History has a place for all of us. Thanks.